September 24th, 1963. Opa-locka, Florida. 29-year-old pilot Geoffrey Sullivan takes off in a twin-engine Beechcraft Travel Air plane from Opa-locka Airport and is accompanied by 37-year-old freelance journalist Alex Rorke, as well as a passenger believed to be a Cuban exile named Enrique Molina Garcia. Over the next several hours, Sullivan flies through the Caribbean and changes his flight plan several times, but after stopping to refuel on the island of Cozumel, the plane and its passengers vanished without a trace. Since Sullivan and Rorke were heavily involved in anti-communist missions against Fidel Castro, it is rumored that they may have been captured and held prisoner in Cuba, but even though Sullivan's daughter eventually files a wrongful death lawsuit against the Cuban government, there are no conclusive answers about what happened to the missing men. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and this week we're going to be traveling back over 60 years to explore an old-fashioned Cold War-era mystery, the 1963 disappearances of Geoffrey Sullivan and Alex Rorke. I first became familiar with this case when it was featured on Unsolved Mysteries many years ago, and I finally felt inspired to cover it last month after I released my Christmas-themed episode about the 1963 murder of Lucille Rinaldi, as Geoffrey Sullivan just happened to live in the same hometown of Waterbury, Connecticut, and went missing only a few months before her murder took place. Sullivan was a former Air Force pilot with a wife and daughter who was making his living as a freelance commercial pilot, but during the early 1960s, his life would drastically change after he became close friends with Alex Rorke, a freelance journalist from New York, who also happened to be a fervent opponent of communism and had become obsessed with ensuring that Fidel Castro was removed from power as the Prime Minister of Cuba. It was rumored that Rorke was a CIA operative, and he hired Sullivan to fly him on a number of covert anti-Castro missions to Cuba, though things eventually reached the point where the United States government had to issue a formal public warning for them to halt their operations. In spite of this, Sullivan agreed to meet Rorke in Florida for another trip to the Caribbean, and they both took off from Opa-locka Airport in a twin-engine Beechcraft Travel Air plane alongside another passenger believed to be a Cuban exile named Enrique Molina Garcia, who may have also been a double agent for Castro. Over the course of the next several hours, Sullivan changed his flight plan multiple times before setting on Belize as his destination, but the plane eventually vanished without a trace, and all three of the men on board were never heard from again. Decades later, Geoffrey's daughter, Sherry Sullivan, decided to launch her own independent investigation and would uncover information to suggest that Garcia may have tricked her father into flying to Cuba before he and Rorke were captured by the military and held prisoner. Based on the information she received, Sherry was able to file a successful wrongful death lawsuit against the Cuban government, though the decision was later overturned on appeal. Regardless, Sherry believed that at the very least, her father was still alive for several years following his disappearance, and the U.S. government covered up what happened to him, so we're going to explore this convoluted story on today's episode. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube Music, Podcast Addict, and more. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word and garner us more exposure. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, including stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content, as our Patreon page has over 90 exclusive bonus episodes in our archives which are not available on our regular feed. So with all that out of the way, let us now delve into the disappearances of Geoffrey Sullivan and Alex Rorke. Our story begins in 1963, and our central figure is 29-year-old Geoffrey Francis Sullivan. Geoffrey lives in his hometown of Waterbury, Connecticut, with his wife Cora Sullivan, whom he has been married to for 8 years, and the couple have a 7-year-old daughter named Sherry. Geoffrey is a veteran who enlisted in the United States Air Force when he was 18 years old and served in the Korean War. After being stationed at Loring Air Force Base in Maine, Geoffrey received an honorable discharge in 1959. He now makes his living as a freelance commercial pilot and spends the brunt of his time working alongside his 37-year-old friend, Alexander Irvin Rorke Jr., who currently lives in Hollywood, Florida with his wife, Jacqueline Rorke, and their 3 children. Alex hails from a wealthy family from New York, as his father, Alexander Rorke Sr., is a former New York City District Attorney turned New York State Appellate Judge who once indicted the original founders of the Communist Party of the United States of America and may have influenced his son's anti-communist beliefs. After serving as a military intelligence specialist in the U.S. Army during World War II, Alex Rorke Jr. became a freelance journalist and photographer who lived in Havana, Cuba for a while and extensively covered the Cuban Revolution, where the government of President Fulgencio Batista was overthrown and Fidel Castro assumed the role of prime minister. While Rorke wrote a number of articles about Cuban exiles and became active in the campaign to overthrow Castro and his new government. After Rorke became the leader of a group of rebels called United States Freedom Fighters and made some critical public comments about Castro's regime, he wound up being jailed before he was deported from Cuba. In 1961, Rorke befriended Geoffrey Sullivan and recruited him to fly freelance, covert, anti-Castro missions into Cuba. Many of these missions involve using planes to drop anti-Castro leaflets throughout the country, but it was rumored that Rorke was a CIA operative who would run illegal arms to anti-Castro groups. After the Cuban Missile Crisis took place in October of 1962, and the United States and the Soviet Union came dangerously close to escalating into full-scale nuclear war, the CIA reportedly started conducting their missions into Cuba much more discreetly. On March 30th, 1963, Rorke found himself in the public spotlight when his 36-foot boat, Violin III, was captured by the Royal Navy near Norman's Cay, an island in the Bahamas located just over halfway between Miami, Florida, and Cuba. Rorke and 16 armed anti-Castro Cuban exiles were on board, and it was rumored that they were planning to use Norman's Cay as a base of operations to launch guerrilla raids on Cuba, and possibly even an assassination attempt on Castro. Rorke openly admitted that the CIA had financed many trips to Cuba involving the Violin III, and the U.S. government had advanced knowledge of these trips, but the boat still wound up being confiscated. It was rumored that Rorke had already been dropped by the CIA by this point, since they considered him to be a loose cannon. Nearly 4 weeks later, Sullivan flew from Connecticut to Hollywood, Florida, in a Beechcraft aircraft that he and Rorke co-owned and often used for their trips to Cuba. On April the 25th, a raid was conducted in which a B-25 bomber flew over Cuba and dropped 5 homemade napalm bombs over some oil refineries located just outside Havana, though since the bombs did not actually explode, the damage turned out to be minimal. Well, Rorke and Sullivan were immediately suspected of being responsible, and 1 month later, their Beechcraft airplane was confiscated by the U.S. Customs Service at Meriden-Markham Municipal Airport in Connecticut, and it wound up being impounded. When questioned, Rorke admitted that he had conducted the bombing raid over the oil refineries alongside 3 other unnamed men, but maintained that Sullivan was not involved. Indeed, Sullivan claimed that after he traveled from Connecticut to Hollywood in the Beechcraft, all he did was fly Rorke to West Palm Beach and then fly him to Washington, D.C. a short time later, but the Beechcraft was not used during the bombing raid. Nonetheless, the airplane continued to remain impounded, and Sullivan and Rorke were informed that they would be fined $13,000 each by the Federal Aviation Agency if an investigation concluded that they had violated civil air regulations, and Sullivan was told that he might also lose his pilot's license over the whole situation. Both men reportedly wound up on the U.S. Customs Service and State Department's watch list of suspected anti-communist activists, and they were warned not to violate any more laws by going on covert missions to Cuba. In August of that year, Rorke gave an interview with the Hollywood Sun-Tatler in which he vowed that his group, United States Freedom Fighters, would resume their armed attacks on Cuba and Sullivan would continue to remain his partner, but all of their raids would be launched from foreign soil in order to avoid violating U.S. neutrality. Rorke also filed a lawsuit against the government for the return of their Beechcraft airplane, as well as his boat, the Violin III. On August the 20th, Rorke and Sullivan traveled to Nassau, Bahamas alongside Rorke's wife Jacqueline and one of their sons in order to make arrangements for a flight to Panama. But even though they claimed they were only traveling to Panama on a legitimate business venture to research lobster routes, they wound up getting expelled by immigration officials who feared that they were planning to set up a new base camp in Panama for future anti-Castro excursions. On September the 15th, the United States government issued an official public statement against Rorke, Sullivan, and 4 other men in which they were warned to bring a halt to all of their anti-Castro operations or they could face up to 2 years imprisonment and a $25,000 fine for each offense. As a result, Rorke's 2 remaining planes would be grounded, as their sojourn certificates which permitted flights to the Caribbean were canceled, and there was reportedly an incident where U.S. Customs officials invaded a private Florida airfield and threatened to shoot the tires on one of Rorke's planes if Sullivan tried to take off in it. Rorke would later claim that this official warning from the government had been issued by direct order of President John F. Kennedy. In spite of this, Rorke and Sullivan still planned to take another trip to the Caribbean. On September the 23rd, 8 days after the government warning was issued, Geoffrey boarded his plane at an airstrip in Waterbury, and his wife Cora was there to see him off. Geoffrey told her that he was traveling to Florida to see Rorke again and planning to return in 5 days, but he said this would be his last trip because he no longer wanted to be involved in any of these operations. He also removed the St. Christopher medal he always wore and gave it to Cora because he didn't want anything to identify him if he was killed, and he said that he would take poison pills if he was ever captured. Geoffrey then took off in his plane, but this would turn out to be the last time he ever spoke to his wife. Later that day, he arrived at an airstrip in Fort Lauderdale and met up with Rorke and 2 other men. The identity of one of these men has never been shared in any of the sources I've found, but the other man was a controversial figure named Frank Sturgis, who had fought alongside Castro during the Cuban Revolution before he became an undercover operative for the CIA and defected to the United States in 1959. And of course, Sturgis would later go on to become one of the 5 burglars who was arrested for breaking into the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C. in June of 1972, a scandal which eventually led to the resignation of President Richard Nixon. Along with Sullivan and Rorke, Sturgis was one of the 6 men named by the U.S. government during the recent warning to halt anti-Castro operations. Rorke's wife Jacqueline would later claim that her husband was planning to travel to Nicaragua to meet with Luis Somoza, who had been the country's president until his resignation in May of that year. According to Jacqueline, Alex wanted to propose the idea of opening an export-import business and marketing lobsters in Panama and Honduras. Alex was also hoping to import tanks of rare fish to the United States in order to sell them, and he would use the money to pay legal fees when he attempted to get his plane and boat back from the government. However, Frank Sturgis claimed that Rorke told him he was planning to purchase a B-25 bomber and hoping to meet Somoza in order to discuss the possibility of establishing a private military base in Nicaragua which would be used for future bombing operations against Cuba. Sturgis said he convinced Rorke that they should first have a meeting with Nicaraguan officials in order to clear the way for this idea. Since the Beechcraft that they normally use for their trips had been impounded, Rorke made arrangements to rent a twin-engine Beechcraft Travel Air plane from a firm who had no knowledge of their anti-Castro operations, and they were scheduled to take off at Opa-locka Airport the following day. Sturgis would later say that he was planning to accompany Rorke and Sullivan on their trip, but he couldn't go because something else came up at the last minute. On the morning of September the 24th, Jacqueline Rorke drove Alex and Geoffrey from Fort Lauderdale to Opa-locka, but while they were on the way to the airport, Alex asked her to pick up another man. Jacqueline would later say that this man appeared to be Spanish, and he spoke in broken English, but she never learned his name. When they arrived at Opa-locka Airport, the three men boarded the rented plane and took off at around 8 a.m. with Sullivan at the controls. However, for reasons unknown, the plane would return to the airport no less than 3 times. In fact, the third time it showed up, the plane started its approach with its landing gear still up, so air traffic control instructed them not to land. The plane then diverted itself to North Perry Airport in Pembroke Pines and eventually landed there instead. But oddly, even though North Perry Airport was only about 30 miles north of Opa-locka Airport, it took the plane nearly 5 hours to fly there, and no one has ever been able to figure out where it was during that lengthy window of time. And when they landed at North Perry, they requested that the plane be refueled, even though its tank was very close to being full. The plane took off again at 1:30 p.m., but even though Rorke had previously expressed his intention to fly to Nicaragua, they submitted a flight plan in which their destination was Tegucigalpa, the capital city of Honduras. Well, just over 2 hours later, Sullivan radioed the tower at Miami International Airport and informed them that they had a revised flight plan and were now traveling to Tucumán, Panama. The air traffic controller informed Sullivan that this destination was about 2 hours beyond the normal range of their aircraft. In response, Sullivan provided a new destination, but it was also well beyond the range of the plane they were flying. The plane would not be heard from again for several hours, but at 10:22 p.m., Sullivan sent in another radio call to the tower at Miami International Airport to inform them that they once again had a revised flight plan and their new destination was Belize, which was part of British Honduras at that time and not yet its own independent country. Shortly after midnight on September the 25th, the plane landed at an airport in Cozumel, an island located 11 miles off Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula, in order to refuel. Even though there were standing military warnings against night takeoffs due to safety issues, the plane still left Cozumel immediately after it refueled, but it soon vanished without a trace, and Sullivan, Rorke, and the mysterious passenger were never heard from again. After Frank Sturgis received word that the plane was overdue in Nicaragua, he called the commander of Naval Intelligence Miami to let them know it was missing. According to Jacqueline Rorke, her husband had told her he expected to be back on September the 29th at the latest, but he failed to show up and made no attempt to contact her, and Sullivan's wife never heard from him either. A massive search effort was launched involving the Coast Guard and the Federal Aviation Agency, who looked all over the Caribbean but failed to find any trace of the plane. While there was speculation that the plane might have crashed somewhere, no wreckage was found to support the scenario. Jacqueline Rorke's father was Sherman Billingsley, who was the founder and owner of the Stork Club, one of the most prestigious nightclubs in New York, and on February the 11th, 1964, he held a press conference there to spread awareness of his son-in-law's disappearance, and Alex's uncle, William Rorke, offered a $25,000 reward for his safe return. But this did not lead anywhere, and Billingsley would later claim that when he wrote to FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover to request his assistance, Hoover responded, quote, "No, I do not want in any way to get involved in this." Shortly after this press conference took place, Cora Sullivan was informed that her husband had been discovered alive in a Cuban prison and would be released and sent home. Cora was even given a scheduled return date for him, and she and her daughter Sherry waited at the home of Geoffrey's mother for his anticipated arrival, but he never showed up, as the information about Geoffrey being found alive turned out not to be true. The story soon faded from the spotlight, and Rorke was legally declared dead in 1968, while Sullivan was declared dead the following year so that their families could collect their Social Security benefits. Cora later remarried and had another daughter, while Sherry herself eventually got married and had a daughter of her own. After Sherry got divorced, she wound up raising her child in Bangor, Maine, as a single mother. Sherry never stopped wondering what happened to her father, but since her family could never afford to hire a private investigator to assist them, she decided to become a licensed private investigator herself. In 1986, Sherry and her attorney, Carl McHugh, worked together to petition the government for information about Geoffrey, and they sent in Freedom of Information Act requests to a number of federal agencies, including the FBI and the CIA. Shortly after they sent their FOIA request to the FBI, McHugh claimed that he had a phone conversation about the situation with an FBI agent who implied that he and Sherry might be better off not getting involved since they would be, quote-unquote, opening a can of worms. In spite of this, Sherry wound up receiving over 5,000 documents from 14 different agencies, but over one-third of the 800 pages they got from the FBI were censored. Sherry also said that there was information in the documents to indicate that at least 400 additional pages had been withheld from them for national security reasons. McHugh received a letter from the CIA in which they claimed that they had never even heard of Geoffrey Sullivan, but he did not believe this was true. McHugh also uncovered an FBI report from May of 1963, which stated that Sullivan and Rorke had been subpoenaed to testify before the United States Senate's Internal Security Subcommittee. Rorke was supposedly going to use this opportunity to share all the details about his relationship with the CIA and his connections to Cuban exiles, but since he and Sullivan both disappeared before the subcommittee's hearing could be convened, they never got the chance to testify. One name which frequently popped up in the FBI documents that Sherry received was Floyd Park, so she decided to make an attempt to track him down, and after obtaining his number, she spoke to him over the phone. Floyd Park was a commercial pilot from Alamo, Texas, and he told Sherry that he had once crossed paths at Stanley Field in Belize with Geoffrey, Alex Rorke, and another man who was likely the mysterious passenger whom they had taken on their flight. According to Park, this encounter took place on September the 25th, 1963, after the three men and their plane were last seen in Cozumel. They had apparently stopped in Belize to refuel again, and Park noticed that their plane was packed full of military weapons. Rorke told Park that their next destination was Tegucigalpa, Honduras, but after the plane took off, there was no record of them ever having arrived there. However, Park claimed that several months later, some people told him that they had seen two Americans matching Sullivan and Rorke's descriptions being forced aboard a Cuban fishing boat in Honduras. Park claimed that he heard rumors that Fidel Castro had put out a bounty on Sullivan and Rorke because of their operations against him, so Park shared all the information he had with the FBI and the CIA. Sherry suspected that the FBI mistakenly forgot to redact Park's name from the documents they sent her following her FOIA request, which was the only reason that she found out who he was. But even though she was able to speak with Park over the phone, Sherry still got the sense that he might be withholding something, as Park never explained how he happened to know her father and Rorke. Following their initial phone call, Sherry was unable to locate Park or get a hold of him again. Sherry also spoke with a journalist named Marty Casey who had worked in Cuba during the 1960s. Casey claimed that sometime in 1965 he was hanging out with two Cuban exiles from Miami when they met up with another man they knew named Carlos Vergara. Even though Casey was speaking Spanish at the time, Vergara immediately recognized his American accent and asked if he knew someone named Rorke. When Casey asked for more information, Vergara mentioned that 2 years earlier he had been in a Cuban prison with a guy named Rorke and a pilot named Sullivan. Naturally, Casey's story only furthered Sherry's suspicions that her father and Rorke had not been killed in a plane crash, but were instead captured and taken to Cuba. Another name which frequently popped up in the FBI documents was Enrique Molina Garcia, a Cuban exile who had defected to Miami about a year before the disappearances, but he was rumored to have been a double agent for the Cuban government, as he was once the personal pilot for Fidel Castro's brother, Raul Castro, who served as Cuba's Minister of Armed Forces. It was suspected that Garcia was the mysterious third man who had accompanied Sullivan and Rorke on their flight, and if there was a bounty on their heads, Garcia may have tricked them into flying to Cuba, where they were subsequently captured and imprisoned. Indeed, there were unconfirmed reports that Garcia had been seen in Havana in the years following the plane's disappearance. In 1987, Carl McHugh filed 2 Freedom of Information Act lawsuits in the U.S. District Court for the District of Maine in Bangor against 9 federal agencies for wrongfully withholding information. One of the suits was for Sherry, while the other was filed on behalf of another Maine family who had also allegedly lost their father on a covert government mission. The following year, Sherry formed a non-profit group called Forgotten Families of the Cold War, which was intended to help families who had lost loved ones to anti-communist activities that were either sponsored by or known to the U.S. government. In 1989, after a Miami newspaper published an article about this case, a Cuban immigrant contacted a local radio talk show program and alleged that a plane containing Sullivan and Rorke had been shot down during combat by an aircraft belonging to Che Guevara, who was Cuba's Minister of Industries at the time. The witness claimed that the two men's plane was taking action to attempt to sabotage Cuba's sugarcane industry, and that Cuba's Ministry of the Revolutionary Armed Forces and their Ministry of the Interior likely had documentation with the registration number of Guevara's aircraft, as well as the day, hour, and location where this incident took place. This documentation was never found, but shortly after this story came out, another Cuban immigrant came forward who claimed that he had been imprisoned at Combinado del Este prison in Havana and once advised the FBI and the CIA that he saw a badly burned American who was inside the prison hospital during the approximate time period when Sullivan and Rorke went missing. This story would be featured on an episode of Unsolved Mysteries, which aired in December of 1990, and Sherry appeared on the show to express her hope that if her father did get captured and sent to prison, he might still be alive somewhere. In the months following the airing of this episode, Sherry was contacted by a Florida man named Stephen Scherer, who claimed that a Cuban exile named Carlos Kersey had been employed as a security guard at his workplace and once told him that he had seen two Caucasian men, one of whom was an American pilot, while he was incarcerated at Combinado del Este prison in 1978. Scherer also claimed that Kersey was friends with another Cuban who had been released from Combinado del Este in 1991, and this person confirmed that these two Americans were still there. However, it does not sound like this information led anywhere, and in 1993, Sherry's two FOIA lawsuits made it to the United States Court of Appeals for the First Circuit in Boston, who ruled that the information which had been withheld in her requests could not be released because of potential national security issues. In October of 1998, Alex Rorke's wife Jacqueline died at the age of 73, and Geoffrey's wife Cora also passed away in June of 2002 at the age of 67. On September the 23rd, 2003, to commemorate the 40th anniversary of the date when Geoffrey was last seen by his family, Maine Governor John Baldacci proclaimed it to be Forgotten Families of the Cold War Recognition and Appreciation Day. A commemorative marker for Geoffrey was given to Sherry by the United States Department of Veteran Affairs and unveiled it during a ceremony at the Garden of Remembrance at the Maine Veterans Memorial Cemetery in Augusta. To this day, the Department of Veteran Affairs is still the only government agency that officially recognizes Geoffrey as missing in action. By 2007, Sherry had become a grandmother and was living in the town of Stockton Springs, but in May of that year, she filed a lawsuit in Waldo County Superior Court in Belfast against Fidel Castro and the Cuban government, alleging that they were responsible for causing her father's imprisonment and eventual death, quote-unquote, intentionally, unlawfully, and with complete disregard for human life. The lawsuit alleged that Castro and his co-defendants were liable under the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act of 1996, which allows victims of states that have been identified as sponsors of terrorism to sue for damages. In the years prior to Sherry's suit, state courts had ruled in favor of the plaintiffs in a number of wrongful death claims against the Castro regime, and damages were paid out from Cuban assets which had been seized by the U.S. government shortly following the Castro Revolution. Sherry expressed her belief that after Geoffrey's plane was shot down in Cuba, both he and Alex Rorke were taken prisoner and tortured for at least a decade before they were executed. The lawsuit presented accounts from a number of eyewitnesses that claimed to have seen Geoffrey in Cuba after 1963, including a private American pilot who was detained in Combinado del Este in 1972 and said that he shared a cell with Geoffrey, who told him he had been incarcerated for nearly 10 years. In September of 2008, the Swiss embassy in Havana managed to serve a copy of Sherry's lawsuit to Cuba's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but they never responded to it. The defendants were ordered to appear in Waldo County Superior Court, but no one affiliated with the Cuban government ever did, so in August of 2009, Waldo County Superior Court Justice Jeffrey Helm issued a default judgment in Sherry's favor. He found the Republic of Cuba guilty for Geoffrey's wrongful death and awarded Sherry $21 million in damages plus interest. In his ruling, Helm confirmed that federal law provided him with the authority to rule on a lawsuit against a foreign government and said that he was swayed by the number of eyewitnesses who placed Geoffrey in Cuba following his disappearance. Helm expressed his dissatisfaction with the Cuban government, repeatedly ignoring Sherry's request for information, stating, quote, "This uncertainty has devastated Miss Sullivan's life," end quote. In response to the judgment, Sherry told the media, quote, "I never once asked for money. I was in court asking for information, either from this government or the Cuban government, and I just can't get it done. I'm still determined to get to the truth. The money will surely make life easier for everybody. It will give me more funds to travel and interview people. I've done this investigation on a dime all these years," end quote. In September of 2011, Sherry filed an action with the United States District Court for the Southern District of Texas in Houston in order to get Cuba to pay her the money they owed, but later that year, the court dismissed the claim as Sherry's attorney was unable to verify that he had successfully notified Cuba of the judgment against them, even though efforts have been made to serve papers through the Swiss embassy in Havana, as well as through Spain, the United Kingdom, Canada, and other countries that had diplomatic relations with Cuba. Well, in June of 2015, for the first time in 54 years, diplomatic relations between Cuba and the United States were restored, and the American embassy in Havana was reopened. So 1 year later, Sherry filed another motion in U.S. District Court for the District of Maine in hopes that they could enforce the original judgment against the Cuban government. However, in October of 2017, the motion wound up being denied, as the court did not believe that Sherry had produced conclusive evidence that her father was the victim of an intentional killing in Cuba, as they felt that she only produced hearsay and unconfirmed speculation that Geoffrey had once been incarcerated there. As a result, none of the damages which were awarded to Sherry have ever been paid out to her. Sherry continues to do sporadic interviews about her father's story and still hopes that one day she will learn the full truth about what happened to him, or at the very least get his remains back so she can give him a proper burial. But after more than 60 years, there's still no conclusive answers about what happened to Geoffrey Sullivan and Alex Rorke. So I guess you could say the trail went cold. So I consider this to be a fairly underrated case from Unsolved Mysteries, as it's never got much discussion online, but I've always found it quite fascinating because of the historical context. For starters, you have two missing people, Geoffrey Sullivan and Alex Rorke, who may have been imprisoned because none other than Fidel Castro placed a bounty on their heads. The Unsolved Mystery segment makes reference to a number of historical events from that time period, including the infamous Bay of Pigs invasion, where the Cuban Democratic Revolutionary Front made a failed attempt to defeat the Cuban Revolutionary Armed Forces and remove Castro from power in April of 1961. Since the whole operation was financed by the U.S. government and the CIA, the result was a colossal embarrassment for them, so the CIA's anti-Castro operations would become a lot more secret and discreet, particularly after the Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world to the brink of nuclear war over 1 year later. But it does not sound like Alex Rorke knew the meaning of the word discreet, which is why the U.S. government literally had to make a public statement warning Rorke, Sullivan, and some other men not to conduct any more anti-Castro operations. It's crazy to think that one of the last people to see Rorke and Sullivan alive was Frank Sturgis, who would later become embroiled in one of the most controversial scandals of all time, Watergate, a decade later. Conspiracy theorists have also suspected that Sturgis may have been involved in the JFK assassination, and since President Kennedy himself allegedly gave the order for the government to issue the public warning against Rorke and Sullivan, and he wound up being assassinated just 2 months after they went missing, I've actually seen speculation that the two cases might be connected, though I personally don't believe that. Regardless, it's pretty surreal to go back and watch the Unsolved Mystery segment and literally see Frank Sturgis himself get interviewed on the show, as he always claimed that he was supposed to accompany Sullivan and Rorke on their fateful flight, but instead went on to do other things. If you look through the newspaper archives, the official story which was reported on by the press back in 1963 and 1964 was that Sullivan and Rorke wanted to travel to Nicaragua to explore the idea of opening an export-import business in order to market lobsters in Central America, as well as import rare fish back to the United States in order to sell it. But the story provided by Sturgis is that Rorke wanted to meet up with the former president of Nicaragua in order to discuss setting up a base of operations there so they could continue performing bombing runs against Cuba. Since Sturgis is obviously not the most trustworthy figure, you could question his story, but I somehow doubt that Rorke would be meeting up with someone like him to begin with if he was merely planning to market lobsters. And remember, before he left Connecticut, Geoffrey Sullivan gave his St. Christopher medal to his wife Cora and said he would take poison pills if he was captured, and once again, I don't think he would be acting this way for a trip about lobsters. This story got quite a bit of press coverage when it originally happened and then faded from the spotlight for 2 decades until Geoffrey's daughter, Sherry Sullivan, decided to launch her own independent investigation into what happened and eventually captured the attention of Unsolved Mysteries. When the episode originally aired in December of 1990, Sherry did think there was a remote chance that her father might still be alive after all these years, and since an individual who was released from Cubanado del Este prison in 1991 supposedly said that Geoffrey was still incarcerated there, I guess you can't completely rule that idea out. All that being said, it's also possible that the simplest explanation is the correct one, as perhaps the twin-engine plane that the group was flying wound up crashing after it refueled on the island of Cozumel. After all, the local military technically forbade planes from taking off at night since there was poor visibility and a number of potential safety issues from flying in the dark. It seems that even though no evidence was found to support the crash theory, the original searchers were inclined to believe this was what happened, but Sherry later wound up speaking with a number of witnesses who were certain that they had seen Sullivan, Rorke, and their alleged passenger, Enrique Molina Garcia, after they went missing. Now, because the Unsolved Mysteries segment was told from Sherry's point of view, we learned a lot more about her father than Alex Rorke, as no one from his family participated in the broadcast, and they've pretty much stayed out of the spotlight since the 1960s. But I think the segment downplays the fact that Sullivan and Rorke were already pretty prominent figures before they even went missing, as the attempted bombing of the Cuban oil refinery in April of 1963 was a pretty big story which got coverage everywhere at the time it happened. And the segment also never mentions the incident where Rorke's boat, the Violin III, was captured by the Royal Navy near the Bahamas with 16 armed Cuban exiles on board, as Rorke may have been planning an assassination attempt on Castro. You could probably do an entire podcast episode on Rorke's life, as he became embroiled in a number of crazy events before he even went missing, and it was clear that he was obsessed with defeating communism and getting Castro out of power. I mentioned earlier that Rorke's father-in-law, Sherman Billingsley, was the owner of the Stork Club in New York, and even held a press conference there after the 2 men disappeared in order to spread awareness of their story and offer a reward. But in actuality, Sherman Billingsley disliked his son-in-law and felt that his daughter Jacqueline was just going through a phase when she became smitten with him, but was taken by surprise when they got married and had children together. After their youngest son was born, and Jacqueline took him to Sherman's mansion in order to meet his grandfather for the first time, Sherman reportedly would not invite Alex inside and forced him to wait in the car. I'm not sure if it was ever officially confirmed if Rorke was an operative with the CIA who ran illegal arms to anti-Castro groups, but if he was, it's been alleged that the CIA cut ties with him because they considered him to be a loose cannon. After all, when he was captured in the Bahamas, Rorke flat out told everyone that the CIA often finances trips to Cuba, so you can understand why the US government had to issue a public warning against him to bring a halt to his covert missions. Given that Rorke and Sullivan went missing just over 1 week after this warning was issued, I can see why conspiracy theorists might believe that Castro put a bounty on their heads and they were set up to be captured by the Cuban military by the United States government. However, even though Sullivan had been working alongside Rorke for 2 years, the narrative presented by the Unsolved Mystery segment is that Sullivan may have become disillusioned with the whole situation, as before he left Connecticut, he told his wife that this would be his last trip because he didn't want to participate in these operations anymore. Indeed, even though Rorke had hired Sullivan to fly him to numerous locations, it's unclear how much direct participation that Sullivan had in the anti-Castro missions. For instance, when the failed bombing attempt was made on the oil refineries, both men always maintained that all Sullivan did was fly Rorke to West Palm Beach and Washington, but he remained behind while Rorke performed the actual bombing raid, and Sullivan may not have even been fully aware of what he was doing. While both men went missing before they were forced to pay the money, they were each fined $13,000 by the FAA for this incident, which is the equivalent of $137,000 today. After Sullivan received the public warning from the government, he may have finally decided that enough was enough, but like I mentioned earlier, even if this was really going to be his final mission, the fact that he gave a St. Christopher medal to his wife indicates that he knew that there was potential danger. The official cover story was that they were traveling to Nicaragua, but the fact that they would go on to revise their flight plan multiple times after they took off from Opa-locka makes me wonder what happened to cause all these changes. So let's follow the movements of Sullivan and Rorke before they disappeared. We know that Sullivan flew from Waterbury to Fort Lauderdale on September the 23rd and met Rorke, Frank Sturgis, and another man, though unfortunately, it's never been publicly revealed who this other man was, so I have no idea if he has any significance to this story. Since the Beechcraft airplane the two men co-owned had been impounded, they were expelled by immigration officials during a recent trip to the Bahamas, and they were both supposedly on a government watch list, Rorke needed to rent a twin-engine Beechcraft Travel Air plane for this particular trip, and the owners of the firm who rented it to him always maintained that they knew nothing about Rorke's anti-Castro operations or had any idea what a notorious figure he was. So technically, Sullivan would be behind the controls of a plane he had never flown before, and I suppose that's one reason you can't discount the possibility that he may have crashed somewhere. After all, when the plane took off from Opa-locka Airport on the morning of September the 24th, it returned there no less than 3 times for reasons that have never been made clear, and the third time around, the plane approached the runway with its landing gear still up and was told by the tower not to land before it flew off again and never returned. That certainly doesn't sound like the mistake that an experienced pilot like Sullivan would make, so is he just having trouble adjusting to the controls of this plane? Or did something just leave him so flustered that he started acting erratically behind the controls? Obviously, since we know Sullivan went on to fly to a number of other locations later that day, he was still capable of handling the plane, so I have to wonder if shortly after takeoff, perhaps Rorke told him that there was a change to their original plans, and he asked Sullivan to fly somewhere where he did not want to go. This prompted Sullivan to attempt to keep heading back to Opa-locka Airport, but for whatever reason, Rorke managed to convince him not to touch down, and they eventually flew to their intended destination. Even though Frank Sturgis was apparently supposed to accompany them on this trip, they instead decided to pick up a Spanish man on their way to the airport who was likely Cuban exile Enrique Molina Garcia. It's unclear when exactly this decision was made, or if Sullivan knew ahead of time that Garcia would be on their flight. If Sullivan didn't want him there, or Garcia shared an all-new change of plans after they took off, and Sullivan wasn't happy with them, this could explain his multiple attempts to return to Opa-locka. Anyway, the plane was next seen when it landed at North Perry Airport in Pembroke Pines at 1:30 p.m., but this part of the story makes no sense, since North Perry is located only about 30 miles from Opa-locka Airport, and it would not have taken them around 5 hours to fly there. It sounds like the plane's movements that day are based entirely on old FAA records, but they've never been able to provide any insight about where the plane could have been during that 5-hour window. When the plane refueled at North Perry, the tank was reportedly almost full, so it couldn't have traveled very far or been cruising through the air the entire 5 hours, so where exactly did it go? The original cover story was that they were planning to fly to Nicaragua, but after the plane took off from North Perry, Sullivan radioed in a flight plan to Tegucigalpa, Honduras, so did something happen which prompted him to make this change? I'm jumping ahead a bit, but I find it interesting that when Floyd Park later told Sherry Sullivan about his alleged encounter with the 3 men in Belize the following day, he said their plane was loaded with military weapons. since this was a rented plane, I'm pretty sure they wouldn't have had these weapons when they took off from Opa-locka, which means that they likely picked them up somewhere. They would have had ample opportunities to do this, so for all we know, perhaps they collected these weapons during the 5-hour window between when they left Opa-locka and arrived at North Perry. Now, technically, we have no official records of the plane having landed anywhere else until it touched down for refueling in Cozumel shortly after midnight on November the 25th, but given that this was over 10 hours after they took off from North Perry, I'm sure it's possible that they landed at some other locations at some point. It ordinarily would have taken just over 2 hours to fly from North Perry to Tegucigalpa, but it was 2 hours later when Sullivan radioed in a new flight plan to Tucumán, Panama, but was informed that his aircraft was unlikely to make that distance without at least a stopover, as it would take over 2 hours to fly from Tegucigalpa to Tucumán International Airport. So once again, what prompted him to change his mind? After that, Sullivan was not heard from for another 6 to 7 hours when he radioed in yet another revised flight plan to Belize, which would only be at about an hour's flight north from Tegucigalpa. However, I seriously doubt that the plane was cruising around in the air for that entire 6 to 7 hour window, so did they land somewhere else during that time frame? If you believe Floyd Park's account of seeing the 3 men and the plane in Belize the following day, then Sullivan's revised flight plan does make sense, but it was conclusively established that they stopped to refuel in Cozumel about 2 hours after Sullivan's final radio call. Cozumel is around 370 miles north of Belize, just over 800 miles north of Tegucigalpa, and around 1,740 miles northwest of Tucumán, so it seems to be quite out of the way from any of the destinations in their flight plans, and there are definitely a lot of gaps and missing puzzle pieces in the plan's whereabouts that night. So one theory which has been pushed forward is that Enrique Molina Garcia was working as a double agent for the Cuban government, and once he learned that Castro had put out a bounty on Sullivan and Rorke, he tricked them into flying to Cuba, where they were subsequently captured and imprisoned. The geography for this scenario does work out, as Cozumel is only about 130 miles southwest from the coast of Cuba. An alternate possibility is that Garcia pulled out a gun and tried to force Sullivan to fly to Cuba against his will, but a struggle could have ensued, which led to them losing control of the plane and crashing into the water. However, I guess this would depend on how much stock you put into Floyd Park's sighting of them in Belize, as it's located in the opposite direction of Cuba. Like I just mentioned, Park said that their plane was loaded with military weapons at that time, and for all we knew, perhaps they took this trip to Belize in order to pick them up there. Rorke apparently told Park that they were planning to fly to Tegucigalpa, which of course is further south. While there does not appear to be any official record of the plane landing in Tegucigalpa, Park claimed that he was later told by some residents of Honduras they saw 2 Americans matching Sullivan and Rorke's descriptions being forced aboard a Cuban fishing boat. So if this story is true, could that mean that Garcia set them up to be captured and taken to Cuba after they arrived in Tegucigalpa? The story goes that Park shared all this information with the FBI and the CIA, and while the FBI likely redacted it from the documents they sent to Sherry following her Freedom of Information Act request, they may have forgotten to redact Floyd Park's name, which is why Sherry was able to get a hold of him and get his side of the story. But the issue is that Sherry only spoke to Park on the phone on one occasion and never met him face to face, and during her Unsolved Mysteries interview, she said she was unable to locate Park or get a hold of him a second time. Of course, she said this 35 years ago, so I have no idea if she was eventually able to speak with Park again, but she always got the sense that he knew more than he was telling. For instance, why did this commercial pilot from Texas just happen to be in Belize at the same time as Sullivan and Rorke? I don't get the sense that they just happened to bump into each other and met for the first time that day, so Park likely had some sort of prior relationship with them, which he did not disclose with Sherry, and he may have also been doing covert work for the U.S. government. If Park was telling the truth, Sherry found it disturbing that the authorities had evidence that her father was still alive for at least a day after he took off from Cozumel, but never told her family about it, and still seemed to lean towards the narrative that the plane crashed somewhere. Sherry has always said that the fact that a good chunk of the documents she received from the FBI were redacted, and around 400 pages were withheld for, quote-unquote, national security reasons, was proof enough to her that they were withholding crucial information about her father's disappearance. If Rorke really was an undercover CIA operative, he may have been doing a lot of shadowy stuff on behalf of the US government, which they did not want getting out, which is why they were willing to disavow any knowledge of Rorke and Sullivan's anti-Castro operations. Of course, the real wild card in this case is Enrique Molina Garcia, who technically went missing alongside them, but there were unconfirmed reports that he was seen alive in Havana in the years following the plane's disappearance. So if he really was a double agent, then perhaps he lived out the rest of his days in Cuba after handing over Rorke and Sullivan to the government. But obviously, since Garcia would have been able to blend in, any eyewitness sightings of him in Cuba were not going to stand out too much, whereas Rorke and Sullivan were Caucasian Americans, and a number of witnesses distinctly recalled seeing men matching their description in Cubanito del Este prison over the course of several years, and possibly even as late as 1991. Perhaps the most compelling of these sightings was shared by Carlos Vergara with journalist Marty Casey in 1965, only 2 years after the two men disappeared, as he specifically mentioned being behind bars with two Americans named Rorke and Sullivan, the latter of whom he said was a pilot. I'm also intrigued by the account from the American pilot, who claimed that he shared a cell with Sullivan in 1972, but the big issue is that there seem to be very few first-hand accounts from people who directly interacted with Sullivan or Rorke, as many of them are second- and third-hand accounts from people who claim to have spoken to other people that described encountering the two men. For instance, we have the account from Stephen Scherer, who claimed that his co-worker, Carlos Kersey, told him that he spent time in Cubanito del Este with two Americans in 1978, and was friends with another person who was released from this prison in 1991 and confirmed that the two Americans were still there. This information was included in Cherry's wrongful death lawsuit against the Cuban government, but I've read the U.S. District Court's decision where they denied Cherry's motion to enforce the $21 million judgment, and they pointed out that all the evidence of her father being imprisoned and murdered in Cuba is based on nothing more than uncorroborated hearsay. They specifically pointed out that even though Carlos Kersey had supposedly shared this story about seeing Geoffrey inside a Cuban prison, the lawsuit never confirmed if Sherry managed to track him down and personally question him to verify his account. While we're on the subject of the lawsuit, it is true that Sherry won $21 million in damages against the Cuban government in Waldo County Superior Court for their alleged culpability in Geoffrey's wrongful death, but this was only done by default because no one representing the defendants bothered to respond or show up. Yes, it was definitely within the judge's authority to do this, but the federal court obviously felt that Sherry's lawsuit did not contain sufficient evidence to prove that Cuba was responsible for unlawfully killing her father. You could debate about the credibility of the eyewitness sightings of Geoffrey inside a Cuban prison, as they could very well be true, but the issue is that it does not sound like there were any direct witnesses to Geoffrey's death or murder. It sounds like most of the witnesses reported seeing two Americans in prison, which means that both Sullivan and Rorke may have been incarcerated together for quite some time, and sadly, if they died behind bars or were executed, they likely wound up in an unmarked grave somewhere. If this is what happened, then it's a pretty horrible fate, as they were likely tortured for information for years on end, and given the circumstances, it probably would have been preferable for them to have died in a plane crash. Of course, just because there was no concrete evidence that Sullivan and Rorke were imprisoned and killed by the Cuban government does not necessarily mean it did not happen, as I think there were too many eyewitness sightings of them to completely discount the idea. I also think it's possible that the US government or the CIA may have been complicit in the two men's disappearances, or at the very least, learned about their capture but did nothing to help them and covered up what they knew from their families. Given that Rorke had become something of a loose cannon who was causing them a lot of headaches, the government may have been glad to be rid of him. After all, Rorke and Sullivan were scheduled to testify before the U.S. Senate's Internal Security Subcommittee, and Rorke was apparently planning to share a lot of details about his relationship with the CIA and Cuban exiles. It's possible that Rorke was going to reveal some things that the CIA and the government did not want coming out, so it was very convenient for them that he happened to go missing before this hearing could take place. But unfortunately for Sullivan, even if he was not as passionate about Rorke's anti-Castro operations and was planning to stop participating in them and go back to living a normal life with his family, he may still have become a victim because he just happened to be along for the ride. If the story about Sullivan and Rorke still being in Cubanado del Este prison in 1991 is true, then it would be incredible to think that they were both still alive when the Unsolved Mysteries episode about their story originally aired. But whatever happened, I think it's safe to say that neither man is still alive today. After all this time, I'm not sure if Sherry will ever learn the full truth about what happened to her father, but at least she got a victory of some sorts when she got the Department of Veteran Affairs to put up a commemorative marker for him in the Garden of Remembrance at the Maine Veterans Memorial Cemetery on the 40-year anniversary of his disappearance. Even if you question their actions during the last years of their life, both Geoffrey and Alex Rorke did serve their country during wartime and deserve to be remembered for it, even if their ultimate fates are unknown. However, if by chance you happen to have any information about their disappearances, please contact the appropriate authorities. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Now, the reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. Over the past 7.5 years, our Patreon page has released over 90 exclusive bonus episodes, which are all currently available in our archives for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3. This past month, I released a holiday-themed bonus episode about the unexplained deaths of Matilda and Patrick Rooney, which took place all the way back on Christmas Day in 1885 and may have involved spontaneous human combustion. I've also dropped an exclusive bonus episode from my spin-off podcast, The Pathway in Chile, in which myself and one of my co-hosts, Jules, discuss a case involving a suspicious suicide, the unexplained 2007 death of Hugues de la Plaza. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've recorded another new audio commentary track, which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries, and we now have over 80 of these commentary tracks in archives. I'd also like to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are Angeline R., Soul Eater 4, and Jennifer H. Thank you all so much for your support. I just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composed the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, or leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube Music, Podcast Addict, or whatever your favorite podcasting platform is. So have yourselves a great week, and be sure to join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.